right, good morning, everybody. This is Dave Smith here with the Secular Dharma Foundation, and I'm very excited to have my old friend Jess Morey on, who I know as JMO. How you doing, JMO?
Good, really good. So happy
Nice.
to see you.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too. That's my excuse for getting in touch with people. It's so hard to get in touch with people nowadays. I'm like, I'll just ask to interview them, and then I get an hour of the time where I can ask you whatever I want. So
All right.
it's a lot of fun for me. Um, so just with these podcasts with the Secular Dharma Foundation, one of the things that we've been exploring is using a lot of early Dharma concepts and really anything in Buddhism and how that can be integrated into secular society around psychology and therapy and addiction treatment and all these things, and how those really kind of a conversation between those two is kind of what we're most interested in. And
Mhm.
so I actually, a couple months ago, was interviewed by somebody, and this woman introduced me on her podcast as a secular Dharma teacher, which I've never been called. And I was like, oh my God, I like that.
Mhm.
And so I was thinking of you today, going, wow, I would actually almost call you a secular Dharma teacher because I've known you for so long, and you've really occupied really different spaces. I know you've done a lot of work with IBME and teenagers and a lot of stuff that we would call secular Dharma. And also, you've been empowered through Insight Meditation Society and you teach retreats over there. So I would imagine your perspective is pretty wide. But the first question I like to ask folks so that I don't get caught on too many tangents is what do you think the secular world offers, whether it's therapy or psychology? What are some of the things you think secular thought offers human flourishing, healing that you think Buddhism falls a little bit thin on?
Oh, wow. That's such a fun question. It's a fun, other way to come at it. I think I'm really focused on psychological approaches right now and trauma
Hmm.
healing and attachment theory. And I can make, to some degree, Dharma fit those. Like I can find the threads between them and ways of understanding and interpreting. But maybe if we're looking just at early Buddhism, like Theravadan, early Pali
Yeah.
Buddhism, uh, I experience the suttas and the framing often as kind of focused on transcendence and sort of anti, this is an extreme way of saying it, but almost anti-life, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I totally find that to be the case. It's funny you mentioned that.
Okay. So for like the Metta Sutta, which I love, there's so much about the Metta Sutta that I love, but you get to the last line and it's if you perfect the practice of metta, this boundless metta, you will never be born into a womb again.
Totally.
As if like that's the worst thing that could happen.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah. I actually I would interrogate that translation, but that's what you
yeah.
see.
Totally. And I've been trying to find alternative
Yeah.
translations, basically
I
looking
have a
for
couple I can
everything.
send you that come from John Peacock that I think you'll like.
Okay, cool. Yeah, please do send me that. I'd
Yeah.
love that. Because
Yeah.
I love that sutta. I teach with it a lot, and I'm
Yeah.
always bothered by that final
I
line.
know. A lot of times I've taken the creative liberty when I don't like translations, I just actually change them. I'm like, we got all the way to the end of this beautiful sutta, and now I gotta say, like, and you'll never have to do this again because this is the worst thing that ever happened to anybody.
Yeah.
It's funny
Yeah.
you bring this up. You're really teeing me off because I agree with you 100%. I think, and this is kind of, we'll go there later in a little bit, but this is kind of the tension for me between a secular Dharma and a traditional kind of monastic Dharma, where there is a anti-human life kind of implication.
Yeah.
And so I
Mhm.
think that for many of us, I'm not trying. I actually would come back and do this again if I get offered the opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think it's about transcendence. I think it's about transformation.
Yeah.
And I
Amen.
think
I love
that
that.
that's one of the things that psychology offers that really kind of is a focus on this life. So
Mhm.
I've definitely picked up on that as well. And so do you find that tying these, of course, we can always tie these threads together, as you mentioned, but sometimes it's like a bit impossible and a bit of a stretch.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's been moments because I also was raised Catholic and
Hmm.
baptized, confirmed, like went to church a lot. My mom was actually a Catholic nun for 9 years
Right.
before leaving that and having children. So I spent a lot of my younger life actually after I got into Buddhism, because the Dalai Lama had this line where he said, like, if you're Christian, go back and be Christian
Yep.
and don't become a Buddhist. So I tried really hard to like make Catholicism make sense. and like digging out feminist perspectives and tons of work there. And then finally at some point I was like, wait, why am I doing all this work? It's not, I can just meditation and Buddhism. So I kind of, I'm like, I don't need to do that. I don't need to save Theravadan practice and culture from itself or to make it acceptable to me. So yeah, it's more like I'm just using what's useful and not using what's not.
You are a secular Dharma teacher. It's interesting to hear you say that because it sounds like, I can just with your facial expressions, it seems like you've definitely wrestled with this quite a bit.
A huge amount. Like I go on, silent personal retreats, like at IMS, for example, and they always have the canon in there, the
Mhm.
Majjhima Nikaya or some of the sutta collections. And, I'm like, okay, I'm a Theravadan insight, accredited or whatever teacher. I should like I should like these suttas and I'll just pick one up and open it and be like, no, 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 no.
Mhm.
Like I just
Yeah,
can't.
I study it. I'm sort of obsessed with the early Buddhist ideas, and I
Mhm.
mostly go at it I've actually looked through academic books better now because like reading there's like not less fun literature out there to read, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's sort of like I think of it also more like art history. I took art
Yeah.
history for a year in high school, and I needed, you look at a certain picture and you're like, what does this say? Like it's a dot, and that you needed the whole history and like interpretation to make it feel meaningful. So
Hmm.
sometimes I have that experience with the suttas. Um,
Well,
yeah.
I'm going to skip ahead because you're teeing me up so good as I suspected you would. Um, this is something that I sit with that I would imagine is something that you sit with, and you might actually appreciate the framing because you and I both come from the same, I would say, lineage. We both had the same early teachers. We both started practicing around the same time. We kind of come from the same pedigree of teachings, even though we've both changed so much. One of the tensions that I find is I feel like it's very important. It's been very important to me to be rooted in the tradition. Like I
Mhm.
feel pretty
Mhm.
much like my Buddhist lineage is I'm rooted in the insight tradition. Jack and Stephen and Michelle, that's kind of the people that so I feel rooted in that tradition. And I also feel rooted in the Pali tradition, but I also don't want to be stuck in the
Mhm.
tradition.
Mhm.
And so, for me, there's a middle way between how do I be rooted and have respect and appreciation and understanding for it without being like feeling like I have to explain some of the trappings of it. Is do you appreciate that framework at all, or has that been part of like maybe the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm totally committed to lineage and rooted. And I think, like, as I think about it sort of freshly right now in the way you're describing it, what feels most important to me is feels like some sense of accountability and and humility. Like that's what feels important to me, and
Nice.
humility and accountability to others who I see as like wiser, deeper, more experienced than me. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is that like we know these particular practices and frameworks have been having incredibly positive results for thousands of years. So there's like a track record of what we're doing. It's not just like newly invented. So those two aspects of lineage are what feel super valuable to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right. When I kind of when you do a Dharma talk or when you teach a meditation, it's like, you have to explain the meditation first, and then you have to do the you have to do the instructions. And I always find that this weird tension between there's the language of explaining, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's the language of training, and they're very,
Yeah.
very different.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
when I talk about what mindfulness is, and then I actually walk you through a guided practice, I'm using completely different types of languages. And I think I find being rooted in the tradition, I'm more interested in the contemplative kind of moment by moment experiences of the lineage that we come from than some of the kind of overarching theories or concepts or principles. And I feel like it's
Okay.
more important for me, it's been more important to kind of lean into the mysterious side of that. Of like, we don't really actually know how this works. We just know that it does.
Yeah.
And there's a
Okay.
limitation in trying to explain it, I think, in a way that can create tension.
Yeah. Cool. I am appreciating that, like the distinction of that. And also, I mean, we have that same very long-term lineage together in the Theravadan tradition, the same teachers. And I've also been incredibly influenced by the Tibetan Vajrayana
Hmm.
tradition. And even from like when I was 18 and I went to Burma and practiced for a while and ordained for a period. But then I also went to India and went to Dharamsala, learned from the Dalai Lama and did a few Tibetan retreats. So even from that age, but it just didn't really get deep into the practice until maybe even like 20 years into practicing. So I do also have that strong influence, and there are ways of explaining the Tibetan and Vajrayana views that are much more non-dual,
Mhm.
make more sense to me. Like I'm more drawn to those
Could you say
metaphysical
more
explanations.
about that? Because that's interesting. Because you do, I notice you've been wider in your Buddhism,
Mhm.
and so I'm just wondering what you might have gained from that kind of later schools of stuff that's been very, very helpful that maybe you didn't get, or maybe the packaging just makes more sense.
Yeah, I mean that's always how I kind of interpret it to myself, like this particular mind and function, but is more attracted to that packaging or interpretation. So for one, the very non-dual perspective. So that point we were saying about having a transcendent, the Theravada has a kind of like get out of here, get to nirvana, get out of here, get out of a body, get out of a womb. The Tibetan, my understanding and training in that is that it's like that nibbana and samsara are not different. They're both right here all the time.
Two
And
sides of the same coin.
yeah, there it's nibbana is right here, right now, and it's about how we are perceiving that reality. And so there is nowhere else to go or get out of or get away from. So that kind of non-dualistic perspective of nibbana right here, sacred world right here, that is like super attractive and
And also a
makes
boatload of suffering right here, depending on how you're
yeah,
dealing with the moment.
yeah, totally. Exactly. Yeah, right. So right here, samsara nibbana, not separate. So that's like kind of probably the most fundamental piece of it. And then the other ones like so related to that, that kind of as a corollary is the concept of Buddha nature, that like the fundamental nature of my mind and of awareness is awakened loving awareness.
Mhm.
Whereas sometimes, and like that is what we realize is there's a it's not just an emptiness or a negation that can sometimes be the way that we interpret early Buddhism. It's
Mhm.
a it's a thing that is quite bright, lucid, and loving that we realize rather than avoid. So that way of framing it is way more attractive to me. It's like, oh, I want to get there.
It's very encouraging because there's an idea, there's a concept, and I think it's actually in the Theravada too, but it's not explicitly named, is that there's this concept of that which is already there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we could call that Buddha nature, we could call it Nibbana, we could call it emptiness. I think people get confused. There's lots of different words people use, but they're talking about the same damn thing.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah. And
that
I think
kind of, yeah.
Mhm. And I think also because like that, the emphasis in early Buddhism on the negation, the way of speaking about Nibbana as negation, as a way to not create concept about it, which is like a super skillful means, can then make the mind think that the experience itself is a not thing or an
Right.
emptiness or a nothing. But I don't think that actually was what the Buddha was pointing to. It's
I don't
just
think
like,
so either.
yeah. So,
Yeah, because it becomes very well, and I think this has been a problem of kind of the insight tradition is like, and we've seen this. There's been thousands of talks on it, the striving. They're
yeah.
like, I'm going to meditate. I'm going to go on these retreats. I'm going to do this whole Dharma thing. And someday there's going to be some event, and on the other side of that event, whatever you think that means, and that just sets us up for so much misery.
Yeah.
Because,
Totally.
I mean, I think it actually ties into a lot of shame and unworthiness around this idea that I'm somehow fundamentally flawed.
Yeah.
And,
Totally.
and and if I'm somehow fundamentally flawed, now I'm chasing after this thing. I don't even know what the hell it is, but
Hmm.
apparently there's this thing that I could get, and I obviously don't have it.
Hmm.
And so I think that creates a big. I think that's a big problem. It's just that position that people get, and I don't think people really address it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I also get curious about how the language and translations and interpretations get then interpreted into like our Western shame, guilt culture, which we could also come into like insecure attachment stuff versus like in Burma. Because I'm thinking about like Sayadaw Pandita, who I practice with and where I ordained, like he would give these talks all the time about uprooting the kilesas, the defilements of mind. And it was such an emphasis. So everything that you just said, right? There's something wrong with me. I'm filled with these defilements. I have to rip them out of my mind. Like that just totally perpetuates this like original sin kind of shame perspective that feels rampant, at least in my upbringing. And it seems like the culture that we swim in. But I'm not sure that Burmese people interpreted that same way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a huge problem. It even says in the discourses it's going to be cut off like a palm stump. And like we
Mhm.
also know, like the secular world, we're science-minded people. We neurobiologically, the idea that these deeply embedded patterns, whatever, like greed, hatred, and confusion, are so built into the system at this point. Like I can't even imagine how I would operate without these things. So I think what it does is it puts us in this, like I think a lot of it is also the Catholicism or the Judeo-Christian world belief that we kind of come up with, and where Nibbana or Nirvana or even more like enlightenment just becomes the Buddhist version of heaven, and clearly
Yeah.
you're not there
Mhm.
yet.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's
totally.
almost like the same paradigm in a different packaging.
Yeah, totally. So it's so interesting now, like as you say, okay, you cut down the palm at the root. Like at the same time, like if I just bring like a healthier psychological perspective on that, and it's like, oh yeah, that's so useful. Like those moments when your mind is going to a certain direction or following a certain thread, and it's just like drop it,
Hmm. Yeah.
drop it right now. And that is like liberation and joy and wisdom. But it's not coming from a like, I am bad and wrong. It's just like out of love for myself, drop it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I think when you put it in psychological terms, it
Mhm.
becomes a lot more kind of obvious.
Yeah.
Like basically that thing you just mentioned, that's a moment by moment skill. Some moments you have it, some moments you don't. And over the arch of our practice, I mean, I have a lot less of these things in my mind. They're still there, but I think it's that idea that people cling to, this kind of once and for all.
Mhm.
And so I think that that's how we interpret it, as a kind of once and for all. And I don't think that really was what the Buddha was talking about, but I think we take that in as kind of an absolute, like, okay, that's going to be the event that's going to happen. And I
Mhm.
just think I don't think that's even possible.
Mhm. Yeah. Though, I mean, this is going off in a little bit of a different, it's like going deeper into the psychological
Yeah.
perspective. Um, because I'm getting really into memory reconsolidation therapy,
Wow.
which I highly recommend. Like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
book called Unlocking the Emotional Brain.
Wow.
And it's about this it's a like rooted in brain science and some of the neuroscience of learning and memory. And it's going into how that's applied to like emotional learnings that cause so much of our pain now. And it's very much saying it's possible to not be struggling with those forever.
Right.
That like most therapy is about you become aware of this like painful pattern you have, and then you learn skills to like regulate it, to do something different, to act different. But it's like you're always in the pattern of seeing it and choosing something else, right? But the theory and the research they've done around this like memory reconsolidation and the way memories work, especially emotional memory, is that you can actually just rewrite the memory so that that emotional pain just does not
Totally.
arise.
See,
And
that
I've
is
had that
insane. That is
experience.
amazing.
I have had that experience in therapeutic experiences. So that at the same time, like that feels like a state change, like something shifted, and I'm not struggling with that particular pattern of pain again. It just doesn't arise. So there also at the same time feel like there are times that like something shifts in a fundamental way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually this is kind of like going into the same territory I want to talk about around therapy. Is I think um the question I'll ask, we don't have to answer, but it's kind of like, what does the Dharma bring into the therapeutic that the therapeutic doesn't have? And I think the conversation between the two is kind of the fundamental goal that I have. It's like, doing the work I've done with Lee Norton and different trauma therapists,
Yeah.
where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of Dan Siegel 101. Like, it's not what happened to us, it's how we make sense of what happened to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember
Yeah.
doing a whole bunch of work with her, doing these anamnesis things, and then like, I think that these states, these emotional, psychological states where there's lots of suffering, are really dependent upon me holding some view
Yeah.
underneath it.
Yes.
And if I change the view
Yeah.
or the belief, and I used to talk about core beliefs, that's not what I'm talking about. And so that we would call that dependent origination, is that this emotional, psychological suffering is dependent upon something to
Mm-hmm.
arise. What is it dependent upon? And if we
Mm-hmm.
can get down into that, and a lot of it, of course, is memory. Most of our suffering is old.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so how you can get that, whether that's a view or a belief, whatever the hell that is, if you can get at that
Yeah.
and change that, then I mean, to me, that's the most interesting thing of all.
Totally. That, like, yeah, exactly. Like, that's what I think about with, I sometimes teach wise view, like beliefs, like limiting beliefs as view. It is like I see in
It's
other terms
all
of
view, definitely.
schemas, internal working models. All of those are views. They're these like what Buddhism would call wise view or unwise view. And exactly like the Eightfold Noble Path starts with that. You shift that, and what is dependent upon it, totally shifts. So yeah, it feels like there's a way that that totally aligns. And then I've been thinking a ton, like as I'm studying more about memory reconsolidation and like in these kinds of therapies that really shift these underlying patterns, like the night of the Buddha's enlightenment, when he went back and
Yeah.
sort of reviewed his all the karma of all his past
Cleaned
lives.
it all up or changed it or
Totally.
something.
Yeah, I'm like that. It's like the way that I'm making sense of it right now is I'm like, oh, he unlearned the unuseful karmic patterns, the unuseful emotional learnings that were causing him suffering. Like you could totally framework that in a whole memory reconsolidation
Well,
framework.
bringing in the Metta Sutta here, I think it's relevant. I think that I think part of that that doesn't get named is part of that actually is there's a relational quality to that as well. There's a
Mm,
way of like, there's the understanding it kind of cognitively, like we could talk about it, but then there's like, how do I feel about it generally? Like, do I have any sense of kindness or ease or compassion? Like, man, wow, that I went through some really hard stuff. And
mhm,
that was really, really hard for me. And so I think that is much of a part of it that also is in the discourse on right view that doesn't always get explained. It's not about what's true or what's not true. It's about what works.
mhm,
You know,
mhm,
that's that if you look at like the teaching on it, the first criteria is one who possesses right view is one who knows what's skillful versus what's unskillful.
mhm.
And I think that, you know, there's the knowing that's there, but then there's knowing how to relate to it. I think that this is where I think like the Brahma Viharas are just totally essential. And I can't even imagine having a Dharma practice that doesn't hold those somewhere in the forefront of the whole practice.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in fact, that's another aspect of my more Tibetan training now. I work a lot with John McCransky. Lama John
Mm,
McCransky is one of his main teachers is Sukni Rinpoche, and so he's totally influenced by Tibetan lineage views. And the whole practice starts with what he calls field of care,
hmm,
which is basically a refuge practice.
yeah,
But I experience it like a metta, but it's a receiving metta. And that is like period how you start
sure.
is connecting with um, the experience of being loved unconditionally. And that actually being the field in which we're swimming when we recognize it.
So that's the beginning.
That's the beginning, step one. And it's a relational field. We only know that through the loving relationship with another,
Mm.
showing us that. Mm.
Well, I would imagine that must tie in really with the work you do around attachment theory. Do you want to unpack that a little bit? Because I know that's been very much a big part of your focus. How does that view fit into all of kind of what you just described there? Because I would imagine it's an essential component.
Yeah, it's totally essential. Well, just to pick up on that particular thread in this field of care practice, I've been doing that with John for like maybe 10 years. I've
Wow.
been following his work and practicing in that way. And now when I teach metta, I always start with that kind of receptive field of care metta, then to self, then to other. Um, and I just learned only a few years ago that John actually has an attachment lens. He works really closely with
No
this,
surprise there, probably, huh?
right? I mean, I was like, yeah, of course, this makes tons of sense. And in the way that I think about that too, I haven't heard John say it in this way exactly like, but similar to attachment theory, like the whole concept of attachment theory is that we have the attachment system to feel safe, but it's paired with the exploratory system, and you only explore as much as you feel safe.
Okay.
So the safer you feel with a reliable, consistent, fiercely protective caregiver, the more the infant, child, toddler will go out and explore the world, the farther they'll go because they
Well,
know they keep running back to
let me
the.
ask you a question then about memory, because so say like I don't have a memory of that, like what you just said. What if I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about?
Yeah.
That
Well,
that must be really difficult to negotiate.
right. I mean, so there's so much about that. that we can talk about. But just the last point, the last thought about that, and then we'll come back to this memory of what is attachment, how do we know what it was like pre-verbally, is so I think about that exploration. So in the attachment research, it's like you feel the safety of the kid to go out to the world and like explore who they are and what they want to do with their lives, right? But I think about it also as like we need a profound amount of safety to explore the nature of reality in our own minds, to like let go of the ego structure and be in the truth of interdependence or not self, or impermanence. Like that takes profound sense of safety.
Well, it's also horrifying, really.
Yeah, exactly. Like just to like let go of that. So that this idea of developing through the field of care and other kinds of refuge practices, an unshakable sense of being held in a loving presence is what allows the mind to let go into awakening, is how I'm starting to conceptualize. And that awakening itself is an exploratory process. So that's like the big picture of how I think about attachment and safety and love with awakening. And John, his book is called Awakening Through Love. So I know that that's within his framework. He doesn't articulate it exactly that way. Okay. So then coming back to this question of like, okay, I don't have any memories of pre-3 years old, which is when attachment patterns get laid down. So yeah, the only way we get to that is by getting into the unconscious enacted mind, right? We can't just ask you like, well, what was it like when you were 2?
Right.
So, but we are embodying that all the time.
So that must be a fairly big project to do that. That's no simple drill.
Yeah. And well, the two things you can do is just like see what's happening in someone's life now. Like what are their patterns in relationship and the emotional patterns? Getting more closely mindful of what's actually happening in their thoughts, their emotions, their sensations when they're struggling in relationship. So that's one. That's like our pointers of what might be underlying. And then there are the two main assessments that I use with people is the adult attachment interview, which is this like 90-minute interview. And it's about your early childhood experiences, but the way that it's coded and assessed is not based on what you say, but it's based on how you talk about your ways of speaking about your experiences. That's what reveals the unconscious underlying patterns.
Now, are you trained? Are you actually conducting those now in your work? Are you doing
I
those for
do.
folks? That's
I'm
amazing.
trained. Yeah, I'm trained in giving the adult attachment interview, and I have a way of doing some analysis on it that's good enough for the work I do with people. To be fully reliably trained takes like 2 years.
Yeah, right.
And I'm going deeper into that, but I'm not there yet.
I remember years ago, God, 10 years ago now, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I did the interview, but I never got it interpreted. I was bummed. I think I should see if I can find it. I should send it to you because I think I actually have the
Yeah.
audio somewhere. But I remember, isn't there also something that tells about how long the interview takes? Isn't that kind of one of the things that actually matters?
Yeah. Well, you start out that way. And yes, it does, because people who are more on the anxious, preoccupied side tend to like be much more tangential and speak a lot.
Yeah.
People who are more on the dismissing side tend to
Yeah, because mine was pretty short.
Great. So you already have a little pointer right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, honestly, if you wanted to send it to me, you could totally send me the audio and I could do an
Nice.
analysis and get back to you. But then it would be interesting to do it again together and see what's changed in those 10, 15 years. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting to go on a tangent. I think, which is also true for us. I would imagine, I know that for me, having kids now, for a majority of my adult life, I assumed that I never wanted kids. I never thought I would have kids. If you asked me 10 years ago, I would be like, no way, never gonna happen. That's the story of my life, though. Everything I said no to, I just say yes to now. And I think that I would probably almost put you in that sort of category. I remember you, and now you have a 2 year old. So how has that journey been? I would imagine that must have been it's been very
Oh,
interesting for me.
huge. And it's been all about trauma recovery.
Yeah,
Like as a child, I mean, I remember so vividly being like 12 and saying, like, I am never putting another human through this.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I don't want to be the cause of someone's suffering. Which is like so pain. I mean, I was a teenager, so let's
Sure.
also give my family credit. Um, so yeah, it was so much about doing the healing. And Lee Norton, thank you to the moon for introducing me to her. So much of the work with her, and then also my meditation teacher and attachment therapist, Dan Brown, who's the Tibetan teacher. um, yeah, there was like a moment when it shifted, and I suddenly was like, oh, I think I could do this and enjoy it, and like be a good enough mother, and that made me finally be like, I'm ready.
That word good enough really, really eases everything down. So
Mm-hmm.
I know you teach retreats still though. How do you have is it a struggle? Like, you're teaching a retreat at IMS or somewhere, and now you have this kind of trauma attachment lens. Is it hard to, because I'm sure you see that present. I have a
Yeah.
little bit of that. I'm not as trained as you are, so I'm able to just kind of stay in the Dharma space. I would imagine is that must be challenging, and also you must sometimes teach with people that you don't know very well. I think I wouldn't do very well in that space. I'm glad that I sort of have become the lone wolf that I have, but how has that been for you?
Yeah, I mean, I totally see the reasoning why and the benefits for you. Um, it's challenging. I mean, actually, in some ways, more because of my interest in Tibetan and Vajrayana
Yeah,
lineages and those views that I'm like not at. Well, there's a couple things that have been challenged. That's one currently that I'm not as like orthodox in
right.
terms of, and my interest in terms of teaching and practice is what is useful. What do I think will be useful for someone? And I don't care if it's like from a later school of Buddhism and an early school of Buddhism. It's
Or like,
like,
the technique varies subtly. It's like, who gives a shit, you know?
yeah, it's just like this, I think will be really useful. This has been really useful when I've had experiences like you're having, try this. And so I have run up against friction there. And then the other place where I ran up against some challenges, like especially during my trainings, because was the secular piece. Because with IB Me Inward Bound, it was always secular. So I learned to teach from a secular perspective always. And
Do you
I
think that
tap,
provided you some advantages? Because I suspect it did. I know it did for me.
yeah, huge. I mean, my perspective on it is that you actually have to understand the Dharma at a much deeper personal level to be able to teach it in a secular way.
Well, because
Because
hide behind your lists and your typical pedigree of, you can't just listen to a Joseph talk and regurgitate it. You actually have to think this shit through.
right, and reinterpret it in your own direct experience in a way that's going to be understandable to a secular audience. 100%. You can't just be like this sutta says that or the Buddha said this.
Yeah,
You
you actually kind of can't do that.
yeah,
I
you
mean, to some
explicitly
degree,
can't.
but you have to be careful, especially if you're in
Yeah,
an education space. That was always the thing for me. I was like, okay, what room am I in today?
yeah. So that's always been, and it's so funny because like I think there are some ways that some teachers like looked down upon or saw it as lesser than to be
Hmm.
coming from the secular perspective. But I have always held the view that you have, and with teenagers, because teenagers could care less. And I'm like, oh, there's this one sutta or that sutta. Like they only care if you're talking about something that's totally real,
Yeah,
meaningful, and you can apply it to them in their lives.
yeah,
And you can only do that if you have if you have a direct experience.
yeah.
So anyway, so that was my like experience of teaching for 10 years. So then when I started teaching at IMS and giving Dharma talks, I got the feedback that I got was I wasn't Buddhist enough
Hmm.
in my teaching.
That's tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Which
So
makes you
that,
kind of, which kind of makes you more Buddhist in your teachings, ironically.
yeah, that
You're
wasn't,
like,
so
I'm
that's
so Buddhist, I don't even need the jargon anymore. I've just let that go. Let,
right.
let me ask you this question, because I worked with Stephen Batcher for a long time, and he's been a part of our organization to some degree. And I remember right before the pandemic, I was with him at Upaya Zen Center, and we got to meet. And I haven't seen him in a couple of years. And one of the first questions he goes, "Do you think you're finding your voice as a teacher?"
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but I love the question. And so,
Yeah.
like, do you feel like I would imagine, how do you feel like in terms of authenticity and the way that you're able to present from all these different places? Are you feeling integrated in that, or is that still kind of a work in progress?
Um, that's great. I actually feel really, yeah, I'd say I feel really integrated in it and really solid. Yeah, and the challenge point is then like teaching at IMS, for example, and trying to figure out like, is there a way I can fit here, or do I just not fit? And that's not worth like the struggle of trying to make it work.
Have they?
Um,
I haven't sat there in years, and of course, I'm not. I've sort of been on my own for so long, which it sometimes makes me so grateful. But are they getting more open-minded or less open-minded, or how? Like, if you go in there and kind of, do you have to kind of be aware of that to some degree? Or will you get called out on that? Is that kind of a tension?
I think it probably depends on who you're teaching with, but my experience is yes, very
Hmm.
much that there's like a kind of framework. And the way that I understand that in a really positive light is that like IMS is like wants to be, it has a lineage and a specificity, and there's a beauty and joy to that. Cause like, yeah, I'm
Totally.
not like the new age free for all at
Right.
all.
Well, they all also they they do what they do. They
Yeah.
do it well. It's kind of like a New England institution at this point. It's
Yeah.
like let's not break with the model that's worked for 50 years. So there's a way of like yeah, respecting that, but then like is there room to shift and how does that shift and do I have to go to another venue or kind of that's that I would imagine is a tension. I've had this conversation with a lot of people actually in your space around this very same idea. I think it's a thing.
Yeah. So I'm in like a deep love and respect of IMS and what they stand for and what they do.
Me too.
And then it's more a question of like, okay, is this then the right place for me to be teaching right now where I'm at?
Mm.
And so actually this year in March, I'll be teaching an contemplative attachment healing retreat, like totally on my own
Where?
here in Vermont
Oh, cool.
in the Potash Hill. So, which suddenly I was like, oh yeah, I've like been running retreats for IBME for 15 years. Like, why don't I just run my own retreat? And so it'll be a 3-day and it'll be my first. It was a student who was like, please do this, please do this. So
Mm.
I'm like super excited because it's like no holes barred. I can completely
I know.
teach in my form what feels totally authentic to me, which I could do with IBME a ton also,
Sure.
the retreats, but and really teach like the attachment framework and more and bring in some of the Tibetan views with the like early Buddhist practices that we're talking about.
Nice.
So that's going to kind of be my first attempt at really
Do you have
teaching.
do you have support? Do you have a co-teacher or an assistant at least?
I have an assistant. I have an
Okay.
assistant, and I have some people who are like scholarship kind of work yogis to help
Yeah.
with. But I'm keeping it really small, like 15 people
Yeah,
max.
I'm at that point now too. Like I said, I feel well. That's the tension for me. Is like I feel totally grateful. I can't, but like this year I'm teaching at Hollyhock, which is amazing. I've always
Oh,
wanted to go up there,
yay.
and but there's that tension of like I don't want more than 30 people in the room almost ever. Like
Mhm.
in some places they're like, they like I don't want to teach a retreat with 50 or 60 people. That doesn't like my general assessment is like at the end of the 7 days, I want to be able to know everybody's first name for the most part.
Yeah,
And so
that's great.
that smaller thing, which it makes me have to work harder because it's like, trying to get, there's a lot of Dharma offerings out there and trying to fill the room or to get those 25 people is always not so easy. So I'm really, really excited that you're kind of stepping into that. And so
Yeah.
so it sounds like now with the work that you're doing, you must be doing quite a bit of one-on-one stuff with people, kind of working in a deeper kind of capacity, going through some of this stuff. Could you just, is that, first of all, is that true? And how has that been?
Yeah, so that's like my primary work right now, other than leading the contemplative semester this fall. I Now I'm just like one-on-one. So it really is like it's a combination between sort of therapeutic and meditation coach.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm with you. I do the same thing. It's a very
yeah,
odd, to even call it anything is impossible.
yeah, because it is definitely therapeutic. And so I'm trained in this attachment protocol called the Ideal Parent
Hmm.
Protocol from Dan Brown, who is a Tibetan meditation master.
Yeah,
Um,
very much so, right? I mean, that's his primary, but he's also Harvard trained. He's also deeply in. So that's just he's an interesting secular Dharma person, I would say, because he's doing
yeah,
stuff. He's doing what he's doing. Nobody's done. He kind of invented that, right?
completely. Yeah. And the way that and so he passed away now 3 years ago,
Oh, he
which
did. I did not know that.
yeah, yeah, totally. Huge loss. Like, because he was also my therapist too.
Oh, that's a bummer.
Um, but the way that I interpret it is that he's kind of adapting, like sort of like what mindfulness, the secular mindfulness movement is. He's adapting some of these like profound Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana practices and views to psychology. So I see the ideal parent practice. It's almost like a deity, a Tibetan deity
Interesting.
practice adapted for this like psychological healing. Um, or maybe what you would call like the Nundro, or it's kind of plays some of the form of the preliminary practices in the Tibetan. That's how I interpret it.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, I practice with him. I was trained by him in that protocol, this attachment protocol. So mostly what I do with people is that practice. And then I've also done a fair amount of internal family systems, like with Lee Norton.
Yeah,
And then I
yeah.
did the level one. So I'm certified in their level one
Cool.
training. So I'll incorporate sometimes parts work, but Right now, I'm really mostly focused on the attachment, the ideal parent protocol with people. Yeah.
Now, how does mindful, I seem like it's obviously like to do anything you just said, you must have to have at least some degree of mindfulness. And mindfulness in its most basic form, just the ability to sort of objectively monitor experience in present
Mhm.
time as it unfolds, like in the most broadest sense. I would imagine how much of that sort of background does one need to engage in that kind of stuff? Because I would imagine your ability to be present with experience that you must have some degree of capacity to do that. Otherwise, this work you're talking about must be just really challenging. There must be some preliminary stuff that needs to be developed.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, completely. Like a basic foundation of mindfulness is huge because you need to be knowing. Okay, so if you're talking about the client, their foundation of mindfulness.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they need to be able to know what are they feeling? What are the sensations in the body? What are the thoughts in the mind? Like that's central to being able to report what their suffering is or what their experience is and then what's shifting. So that kind of um, metacognitive mindfulness awareness is like so vital. And I've discovered that over time because I will now get people who are not meditators, but who know about the ideal parent protocol from a
Huh.
psychological frame and will come and ask me to work with me. And it's such a dramatic difference between people who have foundation in mindfulness, insight, meditation, and people who don't. It's like it's almost like night and day. And there is a part of so part of my requirement, quote unquote, request for people. I mostly now really emphasize only working with meditators because of that distinction. And
That would make a lot of sense, though.
mhm.
I mean, I talk to therapists often. A lot of my students are therapists, and the joke is that like when the therapist gets a new client that has a mindfulness practice, they're like, "Oh my God, this is going to be so great. We're going to get so much done."
Yeah, yeah, that's how it feels. So you, or I mean, so some of the people and who aren't meditators, then I start them in on a basic regimen of meditation from the beginning. I'm just like, this has to be part of what you're doing for us to work really effectively. Because
Yeah.
just that fundamental to be able to like, what are you feeling? What's your emotion? What's going on in your body? Notice what the thought is like it's central to the whole thing.
Because if you
So
ask a regular person off the street that question, they're like, "What?" They're almost like, "What?" They almost think the question's stupid. They're like, "What are you talking about?"
yeah, totally. Which is so crazy, right? After all of these years from such a young age.
Yeah.
But yeah, like even that first insight where you're like, oh, a thought. There's a something that is a thought that's
Yeah.
not me.
Yeah. I
And I
find
can
that happens to me a lot. Do you find that I find that one of the things I kind of beat myself up for is
Mhm.
like how much I feel like I take the practice for granted. I probably am swimming in all this mindfulness that I don't even know that I'm swimming in, and just
Mhm.
feeling um, like I feel like I should have more gratitude than I seem to have. I don't know if that assessment's even true, but
Yeah.
how do you negotiate that kind of aspects. So for me, like mudita, that aspect of the Brahma Viharas, sympathetic joy. I always thought that was a useless translation. For me, appreciative joy is a little better, but for me, it just feels like it's actually gratitude. How much do you use gratitude in your practice and kind of the way working with these really kind of painful experiences? Has that been something that you think about?
Not like yeah. I mean, certainly like big picture, there'll be moments of gratitude where I'm like, I can be with people with intense mind states because of my own personal experience and exploration with those. Like I can feel the ease that I have with certain intense mind states because of my own experiences. So there's like a big picture gratitude of that, like the wounded healer kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
view. Um, but and then the other thing when I'm with clients, often I try to have the practice of asking for three celebrations
Oh,
at the
good.
of every time we meet. Like
Mhm.
what's really working well for you? Um, and then personally, I'm actually trying to I'm getting on the like gratitude bandwagon and trying to
Oh,
like
jump on! It's great. It's weird at the beginning. Because it's so
yeah.
great, but it also hits a lot of stuff that's unpleasant.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So I'm trying that whole the morning practice of
Yeah.
three specific things I'm grateful for. And
Yeah.
then the other one that I'm trying right now is getting in touch with someone every one person every day and appreciating them.
Hmm. Add me to
Which
your list.
right. I'll put you in the order.
Me and Shannon were just talking about that. She's like, I told her we were going to talk today. I said, hope we can actually get around to the interview because I haven't talked to her so long. trying to use the interview as a way to catch up because I think it's so great to, I get your emails and I kind of know more about what you're doing than you can imagine just because of the internet is kind of the way it is. But I always end up then I just have to make up a story about what you're doing that's probably highly inaccurate.
Great.
So that's all good. Let me ask you this question to kind of go back around to where we started around secularity, because I just did a conversation with Stephen Batchelor about this recently about, how much the world is trapped in these binaries and polarization. And one thing I've noticed about starting something called the Secular Dharma Foundation and talking to different people about it, it's like nobody really has a agreed upon definition of what the word is, and there's actually a lot of like kind of people can be very critical of the concept, and a lot of times I think one of the confusing things is that people get in the binary of either I'm a secular person or I'm a religious person, and I think that
Mhm.
that's kind of I don't think that's true. I think that's kind of too reductive way of seeing it. But for me, it's like the negotiation I have is what's the middle way between secularity and religion?
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering how you traverse that. I mean, we know that you grew up religious and Buddhism is a religion. Did you think about that much? How much does that play into the way that you think about things and practice about things? Do you find maybe that you don't even think about it so much, or how would you kind of think about that?
Mhm. I would say that I generally personally don't think about it that much. Like I certainly had to think about it a lot more when we were doing stuff in schools,
Yeah,
uh, to be, which is really like the religion of science, and you know, so that's also a way I see it as a view.
yeah.
Um, but I also feel really comfortable holding like paradoxical views at the same time,
There you go.
like a little bit of like, oh, but who knows,
Right.
like that, yeah, it could be that way, could be
Because we
that
could
way.
put the same framework over what you're doing now too, where it's like, like and this has been my experience. It sounds like to me, it's like I know now and I believe now that Dharma practice is not going to be enough for me to do all the things that I need to do to thrive in this world and to overcome all my struggles. It's limited.
Yeah.
But I
Mhm.
also know that people, I know that psychotherapy and trauma therapy, all that stuff is great too, but that doesn't seem to actually be able to do the heavy lifting for all of that stuff either. And it seems
Mhm.
like it's almost this contemplative, therapeutic modality. And of course, we've been seeing it for 20 years. It started with Peter Levine, and then there's EMDR and the stuff that you're doing now. It seems to be like our generation of teachers have just by virtue of so many things, find ourselves. I think a lot of people who I would be our peers are kind of just finding ourselves having to do whatever version of this that we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, everyone is. And even if they're not talking about it super publicly,
Yeah,
like we're all doing it. But I mean, even in my first 3-month retreat, which was like, almost, oh my gosh, like 25 years ago or something. So the Steve, what's his name? Angler. Um,
Jack Engler.
Jack Angler spoke at the end. They had him speak the last.
He spoke at the end of mine too. I actually ended up doing therapy with him after that because I liked him so much. He
Right, right.
passed
So
away
he's,
too, unfortunately.
yeah,
He was
recently.
fucking
So
awesome, that
yeah,
guy.
totally. So he gave that whole talk at the end of the retreat that was basically like, he's a psychologist and he's like, y'all, this isn't going to fix all your stuff. You need to do psychology. You need to do therapy as well as meditate. It
Yeah.
was such a clear message.
It was one of the
Like,
best talks I ever sat through. I was funny because I did the 3 month retreat and that he gave the final talk.
yeah, that's awesome.
That must have been something that they did. That must have been like a
Yeah,
thing.
right. They were kind of like, people need to know this.
And it was
So,
like
yes.
2 hours. It was the best part of the retreat for me, actually.
Yeah, it really was a huge takeaway. It had a big impact on my
Yeah.
perspective. Because it would have been easy to be like, oh, just notice that as like an empty arising and let it
Yeah.
go or something. And so to have someone be like, no, actually, it matters for you to work with the content
Yeah.
was really valuable.
Well,
Mhm.
I think the message was, and I think this maybe comes from the kind of 90s, Upandita methodology was like, like Dharma teachers would famously say in the interview, well, I don't do content.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
how convenient is that?
Mhm.
And now, like, because of that, you and I are finding ourselves having to do lots of content and realizing actually the content matters more than perhaps we thought.
Right. And the more that I do the content with myself and other people, the closer and more real full awakening is to me. It is, that has been such a parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, see, for me, the universal is not a rejection of the content, but the content for me is what leads to the universal.
Ah,
And
cool.
so,
Yeah.
that's the transcendence thing. Like, just skip all the content and just go to this, like as if that were possible, and probably a terrible idea, really. And so I find that it's almost like not even like it's definitely not transcendence. Maybe it's transformation, but it's probably more like integration.
Right. And again, like come back to that, like the story of the Buddha's enlightenment that night, where he's just reviewed the karma of his entire life. Like if you take that from the view we're discussing, it's basically that's what the Buddha was saying. Like I had to do all the content and
Right.
then I awakened fully.
Yeah, I did 5,000 years of content in one night.
Yeah. And that's how I got awakened, you know? Oh, but also the earth supported me with
Yeah.
her love and validation.
Yeah.
Like it was relational, content based.
Yeah.
It's one way of interpreting that story.
That's a good story. I don't teach, I tend to stay away from those kind of stories, but I like it when I get framed in a different way. Like, oh,
Mhm.
actually, that's right. Oh, maybe that's actually probably what he was doing.
Yeah. Right? Going through it. Yeah. Eons of
Yeah.
content.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And waking up.
Hmm.
So, we're getting to the end here. What are you excited about? What's going on that you're like really, I'm sure quite a bit, but what are you looking forward to, dare I say?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm really looking forward to this retreat that I'm teaching in March. So like it really feels like this first like
How many
y-
days?
it'll be 3 nights, 3 days,
Nice.
3 full days, 3 nights. Just like that, like, oh my God, there's really no parents around. I still self-identify as a teenage meditator. Uh, but really being able to like fully create that and in a way that feels meaningful to me. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm also really looking forward to like deepening my relationship with John McCransky. So I think we're
Cool.
gonna
I
hopefully
don't
teach.
know. I know his name and I've seen him come across my screen many, many times, but I'll definitely take a look. I don't know too much about him, but he definitely is somebody who I see his name in lots of different spots. And I've always been like, I wonder what's up with that guy.
He would be an awesome person to have on. He's
Cool.
totally secular Dharma, 150%
Where
secular
is
Dharma.
he?
He's in Boston.
He's
He
in
was a
Boston.
professor at Boston College
Okay.
of Buddhism, but has a completely secular approach to it. Which maybe I'll just like circle back to that question of
Sure.
secular and secularity. Like Lama Rod Owens,
Yep.
he taught the IBM teacher training with us for a while, and he taught this session on secularity and his framework. And I don't know if there's other ways where you can listen to this, but uh, with secularity being like a place that it's all welcome, like all
Right.
the different religious
I think
perspectives.
that's how I see it. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah,
I think
totally.
he even used the term intersectional mindfulness.
Yeah, cool. That sounds like, and yeah, I like that. And then I include a modern scientific worldview as like
Yeah.
one of the kind of religion's
See,
views.
that's how we at the foundation. That's how we hold secularity. Everything. It's all welcome and open.
Okay.
And then so for us it's not a dogma. It's not a new dogma. People ask us, well, what does secular Dharma say about this? It's like it doesn't say anything about anything. It's really a dialogue, which is why we're doing these podcasts and these discussions. It's a discussion that hopefully is interesting and just can give people new ideas of trying to deepen their practice in a meaningful way and hopefully challenge people. I know that one of the things that's been most helpful to me is to be really, really challenged about some of the right way to do it, and it's like this. And I think I picked a lot of that up from being trained in Against the Stream and so forth. But
Mhm.
I've had to dismantle. I find myself always having to dismantle ways in which I'm clinging to the method.
Yeah. Wow. Cool. That's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah,
Great. So yeah, that's what I'm excited about in my practice, like John, and then one of his main teachers is Sokni Rinpoche. So
yeah.
I'm exploring that more, teachings with him. Um, and then the other, we just put a contract on a house
Ooh, where?
in Vermont.
Nice.
Yeah. And which is like part like that thing you keep doing things you thought you would never do.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
I
yeah.
so thought I would never buy a house and be a
Owning a
house.
house is where it's at.
Oh my God. I'm like terrified. I like have never, so wait, I'm 45 and I've like never had to like mow my lawn or fix my own dishwasher.
You'll love it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Forward to it.
Well,
Yeah.
hey, it's great to have you this morning,
Mhm.
and I'll let you know when this goes up, and we'll add some information in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dave.
You bet.